There's a quiet truth about children who grow up unseen. They often become adults who doubt whether they deserve to be noticed at all. They walk into rooms trying to take up as little space as possible. They enter relationships wondering if they're asking for too much. They achieve things yet brace themselves for those moments to be dismissed, because invisibility became familiar before they even understood the word. This isn't because they lack value. It's because their earliest sense of self was shaped in silence. Psychologists call this an internalized neglect pattern, a mental blueprint where the brain learns to expect indifference, to anticipate being brushed aside, to believe that needing anything is a burden. A child who is ignored long enough eventually stops reaching out. They convince themselves that wanting comfort, affection, or understanding is somehow wrong. Think of a little child standing in a crowded room, gently tugging a parent's sleeve, waiting for even a moment of recognition. You've probably seen it. On a playground, in a classroom, maybe in your own family, the child who doesn't demand attention, who doesn't throw tantrums, but quietly disappears into the background. From the outside, nothing dramatic seems to be happening, but inside that child's world, something enormous is shifting, because for a child, being ignored is not a small inconvenience. It feels like a deep crack forming at the core of who they are. And here's the heartbreaking part. Neglect doesn't always look harsh or intentional. Sometimes it looks like absence, a distracted parent, a forgotten question, a missed birthday, a home where no one looks up, even when the child is standing right there. The psychology of invisibility takes root quietly, shaping how they view themselves, how they understand safety, and how they build relationships years later. We often say children are resilient, and they are, but adapting is not the same as healing. A child who grows up without acknowledgement adapts by shrinking. They hide their needs. They decide, often without words, that they matter less than everyone else. This helps them survive childhood, but quietly complicates their adulthood. From a psychological standpoint, being acknowledged isn't a luxury, it's a need. Research repeatedly shows that children require three main pillars to thrive: safety, stimulation, and connection. The third one, connection, is where a child learns who they are. Attachment theorists like John Bowlby explain that when a caregiver responds consistently to a child's needs, the child develops a sense of security that becomes their emotional foundation. But when a child's attempts for connection are met with silence or inconsistency, they internalize a dangerous belief. Maybe I'm not worth noticing. Neuroscience supports this. When a child's bids for connection are ignored again and again, the brain treats it like threat. Stress hormones spike. Over time, the nervous system adapts to expect rejection. Their baseline becomes anxiety. Their emotional world becomes unstable. And yet from the outside, they may just look quiet. When a child faces outright abuse, the damage is visible. But when a child is ignored, the wound is hidden, but just as deep. They stop asking questions because they expect no answer. They stop showing excitement because no one responds. Eventually, they disappear, not physically, but emotionally. This is what psychologists call emotional neglect. It leaves no bruises, but it leaves lifelong imprints. These imprints often appear in adulthood, when the ignored child tries to love, trust, or dream, but runs into the unhealed silence of their past. Many adults raised in emotional neglect struggle with low confidence. They fear expressing themselves because they assume no one cares. Some avoid relationships to escape rejection. Others cling tightly to affection because they're terrified of losing it. And some exhaust themselves trying to win approval they never received as children. Picture an 8-year-old running home with a drawing they're proud of. They hold it up waiting for praise, but the parent is busy, on the phone, cooking, lost in thought. The moment passes. Multiply that by hundreds of moments across childhood, and something inside the child shifts. They learn that pride, joy, excitement are things best kept private. Years later, that same child becomes an adult who cannot celebrate their own victories. The ignored child learns to ignore themselves. A large body of research supports this. A 2019 study showed that emotional neglect in childhood is strongly linked to chronic loneliness in adulthood, even when surrounded by people. That emptiness doesn't come from isolation. It comes from years of being emotionally unseen. Most parents who ignore their children don't do it to harm them. Many are overwhelmed, exhausted, struggling with mental health, or simply unaware of how vital acknowledgement is. In the modern world, distractions are everywhere. Phones, screens, work stress, deadlines. But the child feels the same silence regardless of the parent's intention. Understanding this psychology is important because awareness breaks the cycle. Ignored children often develop coping behaviors that look like strengths. Some become fiercely independent. Some become perfectionists. Some become peacekeepers who avoid conflict at any cost. But under those strengths lies fatigue. The independent child becomes the adult who can't rely on anyone. The achiever becomes the adult who never feels good enough. The peacekeeper becomes the people pleaser who loses themselves trying to stay connected. And perhaps the saddest response is the child who gives up, who decides, if no one cares anyway, why try? That child grows into an adult who doubts everything, their worth, their abilities, their dreams. Ignored children rarely speak about their experiences, because how do you describe a wound created by silence? There's no dramatic story to point to, no visible injury, just a long series of moments that should have mattered, but were met with nothing, because the wound is invisible. Adults who grew up ignored sometimes downplay their own trauma. They say, nothing bad happened to me, but the absence of something crucial is still a wound. It's like growing up in a house with no air. You may survive, but it doesn't mean you were breathing. Long-term effects are real. Studies show increased risks of anxiety, depression, emotional shutdown, and difficulty forming deep connections. Neglect weakens neural pathways that shape resilience, meaning the child grows up without the emotional tools they deserved. But this doesn't mean their fate is sealed. In fact, many adults who were ignored as children become deeply compassionate humans. They pay attention to others because they understand the sting of being unseen. They develop incredible emotional intelligence, able to read expressions, tones, subtle shifts in mood. That hyper-awareness was once survival. In adulthood, it can become a gift, but it comes with a cost. They prioritize others and forget themselves. There's another truth, rarely discussed. When a child is ignored, their identity remains blurry. They were never mirrored back. No one reflected their emotions, thoughts, or inner world. So they grow up searching for validation, not out of vanity, but because they were never given the emotional mirror they needed. Identity is built in connection. Without it, the self becomes fragile. And yet, the human mind is resilient. Even children who grow up in emotional silence carry a quiet hope. That hope is why so many of them seek healing later in life. They read, they journal, they go to therapy, they explore their inner world. They refuse to live forever in the silence they were raised in. Healing is possible. The brain can rewire. Every moment of healthy connection teaches the nervous system a new truth. Healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's small, celebrating your achievements, admitting when you're hurt, telling someone, I need you, whispering to yourself, my feelings matter. These small acts are rebellions against years of silence. It isn't easy. Ignored children grow into adults who fear rejection more than anything, so using their voice feels terrifying. Setting boundaries feels like betrayal. Asking for help feels like weakness. But doing these things, slowly, consistently, is what rebuilds the self. It's also important to remember this. Parents who ignored their children were often ignored themselves. Emotional neglect runs through generations like an echo. When an adult decides to heal, they aren't just healing their own wounds. They're breaking a cycle that may stretch back decades. Every ignored child who learns to value themselves becomes a person who teaches the next generation how to feel seen. And that brings us to the deeper truth. Ignored children often believe they left no mark on the world, but the reality is the opposite. Their journey carries enormous strength. Their willingness to examine their pain, to break the silence, to rebuild themselves, that inspires others. So if you were that child, the one who sat quietly hoping someone would notice, the one who carried emotions too heavy for small shoulders, the one who wondered whether your presence made any difference, hear this now. You were important then. You are important now. Your existence has always held weight. Healing isn't about pretending the past didn't hurt. It's about finally offering yourself the care, the gentleness, and the recognition you should have grown up with. It's about learning to view yourself not through the lens of neglect, but through the lens of understanding and compassion. Yes, the silence shaped you, but it does not get to define your entire story. The journey of the ignored child is not just a story of suffering, it is a story of incredible strength. It shows that even quiet wounds can teach deep empathy. It shows that the parts of you that once hid in the shadows can still become sources of clarity and connection. And when the child who once felt invisible chooses to speak, chooses to heal, chooses to see themselves, something remarkable happens. They become the adult who never overlooks others. They become the person who listens, who understands, who notices what others miss. And in that transformation, brave, imperfect, powerful, They discover a truth that was waiting all along. They were never without value, never without a voice, never truly unseen. They were simply waiting for the moment they would finally recognize themselves.